And I know we have at least one Earl first-time visitor here, and Earl and everyone else, I'll use this as a time to remind all that we are recording all of these. So all of these lessons are recorded. Rick is, he's got a really nice setup on the church's website where you can go and you can catch up. So you can find all the previous lessons on the church website. All you got to do is go to, gtown.cc, I think, the church's website, and then find the Sunday school.
Well, the front page changed.
Oh, okay.
Once you get out to the website, click on More, and over in the upper right corner, then you'll see Sunday School.
Okay. Yeah, you can find it. You might have to do a little digging. I had a guy, actually, after service this morning, come to me and ask me how much we charge for that. So I don't know. I said, unless Rick's taking a little cut off the top, I'm not getting paid anything for it.
Did your head swell when he asked?
Huh?
Did your head swell when he asked?
But no, it did not. But I did. So I pulled it up to make sure Rick wasn't skimming, and I showed. I don't know what he went to, but he said he went somewhere, and it said you had to pay for it. I don't think. I don't know about it. I pulled it up and showed him how to get to it, at least from the mobile site, and it went right into it. So Rick's pay-per-view. So I don't know what's going on over here with this, but it is free, and you can catch up on all the Daniel lessons, and our Revelation study is there also. So now that'll take you about 2 years. But anyway, so we made our way to. I think we got to chapter 6, which is truly probably one of the most well-known stories in the entire Bible. And we're talking here about Daniel in the lion's den. So clearly, folks that don't even, I mean, this is people that don't even go to church, that don't study the Bible, even people with very little familiarity with the Bible at all, probably have heard the story of Daniel and the lion's den. Of course, it's a kid's favorite. You know, I challenge you to find a kid's Bible storybook that does not have Daniel and the lion's den. But most people don't really know the whole context, you know, behind the stuff. Why Daniel was thrown in the lion's den in the first place, and what was happening in the kingdom at that time. So last week, we did finish chapter 5, which of course was the end of the Babylonian Empire. So we've been studying this. Daniel and his buddies around 605 BC were taken from Jerusalem and taken, exiled to Babylon, which was clear across the Arabian desert over here in Mesopotamia. And that was when they were probably teenagers. Daniel, as you know, quickly rose ranks and became second in command in Babylon under King Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar died. We talked about the brief reign of all these other kings until we get to Nabonidus, who appoints his son Belshazzar as co-regent, and they reigned until 539 BC when the kingdom came to an end. Rick did take this diagram that I tried to do. It's very sloppy. Rick made it nice and neat, and he's so gifted in this type of stuff. But this diagram really portrays the kings of Babylon and gives a good timeline of that. So if you want to pick one of these up,
Are they free?
I don't know how much. Yeah,
They cost.
how much? I don't know how much Rick's charging. So Daniel chapter 5 was the end of the Babylonian Empire. We know that was the night Belshazzar was throwing this big feast, big party in the palace. It was a drunken debauchery, all sorts of crazy things going on. And all of a sudden, the handwriting on the wall, the finger comes in, writes the message on the wall. Belshazzar thought he'd probably had a little too much wine, and he was freaking out. But ultimately, we realized that was the hand of God telling him what? His time was up, right? The message on the wall was Mene, Tekel, Perez, which means God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And that very night, we know that the Medo-Persian army came in and conquered Babylon, killed Belshazzar, and secular history backs that up. You remember we talked about that last week, but you can find, the Greek historians, Herodotus, Xenophon, Josephus talks about these things. So secular history supports, actually, that on October 12th, 539 BC is when history tells us that actually happened. That the Babylonian Empire came to an end, the Medo-Persian Empire came in, killed Belshazzar, and took over. And we read there at the end that this was a guy named Darius the Mede was actually the one that took over the kingdom at the age of 62. I believe at the end of class I asked you probably don't remember this, but I asked you to kind of look at this Darius the Mede character. And did anybody do that?
Yes.
All right. So what do we find? I got some good students in here. So who is this Darius the Mede? What'd you find?
I found out, I looked it up and said he didn't exist.
Okay.
There was no mention of Darius.
In secular history, there's not a whole lot of corroboration of a Darius the Mede. That's true. Cookie, what'd you find?
He was a relative of Cyrus.
Okay, maybe a relative. There are different theories. And there's some controversy around this. I mean, Cyrus the Great is well documented. And Cyrus the Great, most secular history puts Cyrus the Great as being the leader of the Persian and actually the entire Medo-Persian Empire at this time in history. So 539 BC, Cyrus the Great is the leader of Persia when they conquered the Babylonians. Now, Cookie said she heard Darius the Mede, or read that Darius the Mede was a relative of Cyrus the Great. James said there's no real secular history pointing to him. Anybody else find anything as far as Darius? D-A-R-I-U-S. Now, secular history does tell us, and the Bible, the Bible and secular history line up in a lot of ways, that Cyrus the Great was the leader of the Persians at this time. There is a Darius the First, or some say Darius, some say Darius. There was a Darius the First or Darius the Great that did rule the Medo-Persian Empire. But he didn't come along until 522 BC. There was then a Darius the Second who came along sometime later, like 423 BC. Between Darius the First and Darius the Second, there was a Xerxes. You've heard of Xerxes? What book of the Bible is he prominent in? Anybody know? Esther. Yeah. He is the king in the book of Esther. So Esther ends up marrying or becoming the queen of Xerxes. So yeah, he comes along, and there was an Artaxerxes the First, Xerxes the Second. So secular history points to some guys down the line named Darius, but Darius the Mede, not sure really who he is. Some say that Darius the Mede is just a throne name of Cyrus the Great. That Cyrus actually was Darius the Mede. However, the end of chapter 6, if you look at the very last verse of chapter 6, and I know we're skipping ahead here, but chapter 6, verse 28 says, "So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian." So some say that tells you that they are different guys, although there are some transcripts of the Old Testament, or some of the Old Testament writings, and some of your Bibles may say this, some translations have Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius, that is the reign of Cyrus, which lends some credence to the theory that maybe it's the same person. So I don't know whether it's the same person. Most scholars say Darius the Mede was a fellow that Cyrus put in place sort of as the leading official of the area of Babylon. Because the Persian Empire ended up spanning a great distance, all the way over into modern day Turkey, down to Egypt, all the way over east of Babylon. So the Medo-Persian Empire ends up being huge, and some say that Cyrus put this Darius the Mede in charge. I don't know. Some say, you remember last week I mentioned this guy Ugbaru Gobrias, who was a general of Cyrus that actually led the siege of Babylon. Some say it was him. We really don't know for sure who Darius is. But he was somebody who had some level of authority here in the area. So I want you to just take a look now over at chapter 6, and we're going to get into this story of Daniel and the lion's den. But I just wanted to do all that sort of by way of a quick review, but just to set the stage that we are now post 539 BC. So 539 BC is when the Medo-Persians took over the Babylonian Empire. On our statue from the dream in Daniel chapter 2, we've now moved past the head of gold, and we moved into what?
Chest.
The chest and arms of silver. That's what the dream meant, that the Medo-Persian Empire would come after the Babylonian Empire. That's now happened, and we've got King Cyrus is in charge, and he's got this guy, we believe, Darius the Mede, kind of reigning and ruling in the area of Babylon. Let's just read the first few verses of chapter 6. It says, it pleased Darius, sorry, I'm leaning too far forward.
No, you're good.
It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them, so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel and his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, we will never find any basis for charges against this man, Daniel, unless it has something to do with the law of his God. So, basically what happens here, and remember, whether we're talking about Darius the Mede or Cyrus the Great, this is, it's the new kingdom that has taken over. And you remember in chapter 5, how old was Daniel at the end of chapter 5? When this he was in his 80s. So Daniel, as a young man, was taken captive and brought back to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar in 605 BC, at which time he and his buddies were teenagers. These young men were taken from Jerusalem. They were the best and the brightest, brought back, trained in the ways of the Babylonians. And Daniel, as a young man, so impressed the king that he rose to the position really of second in charge in the Babylonian Empire. It's an amazing story in and of itself that a guy from a slave, basically, from another land, serving a totally different God, totally different set of principles, could be brought and rise to such a position of prominence. But Daniel did it as a very young man. He then served Nebuchadnezzar for probably over 40 years. But then he seems to have gone into some type of a retirement, because when we get down here to 539, Belshazzar, though he was familiar with Daniel, it didn't really seem that Daniel was still in that governmental type position, did it? I mean, because you remember the queen mother came in and suggested to Belshazzar that she call Daniel in. Didn't really seem like he still was real familiar with Daniel. So Daniel, at the age of probably 82, 83 years old, had retired. And I think he probably earned that. But now, after chapter 5, and the end of chapter 5, somehow Daniel has so impressed the new regime that when Darius appoints these 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, and then he places 3 administrators over the 120. He chooses Daniel as one of the 3 administrators. Now, what are these satraps? When I say satrap, what's that?
My Bible says princes.
A prince, and some translations say a prince. So some say satrap, some say a prince. That's really like it's a provincial governor. So it's sort of think of a governor of a province. So, you got the whole kingdom here, we've got the United States, our whole country, but then we have 50 states, and each state has a governor. So the satraps or princes are over a smaller province within the greater kingdom. That's what these satraps were. And why did Darius think that he needed these satraps? Does it tell us what their role was?
Protect the king.
Basically to protect the king from what?
No loss.
Loss,
What's that?
probably an enemy that could sneak in.
Could be. I mean, it could be
Or
a.
taxes.
It could be loss, or it could be that like a loss of power.
Yeah.
It could be financial. Their job was to basically protect all matters of the king, whether it be security, safety, financial, uprising, keep people in line, make sure people are paying their due taxes. Ray.
I read it as to protect them from conspirators.
Yeah. Any conspirators, which certainly could lead to uprising or loss of power. So yeah, to keep people in check was the job. And kind of what we're seeing now is, Nebuchadnezzar, the old regime, he had advisors surrounding him too. But it really looks like the Medo-Persian Empire, there's going to be more of a sort of a distribution of powers. There's going to be, it's not so much just this single absolute monarchy where the king of Babylon was an absolute despot. I mean, whatever he said went. Now there's going to be more of a balancing separation of powers, different branches to protect the kingdom. And he's got these 120 satraps, and then he's got 3 administrators over the 120. So some checks and balances are being put into place, and Daniel is made one of the 3. All right, so you can picture this. I don't know if Daniel wanted this job or not at the ripe old age of 85, probably at this point, but he took it.
Well, he didn't want the position that was given to him at Belshazzar, and yet he was given, or
Sometimes
whatever his name was, and yet he gave it to him anyway.
that's true. So sometimes, God puts you in a position, and Daniel was, so he served now multiple kings for years and decades, but the one king that Daniel always kept at the center of his life was who? God. I mean, Daniel never lost sight through all of these different regimes, these different kingdoms. He was faithful to King God above all. So now you can see what's happening here. We know how Daniel is. I mean, Daniel has always been an impressive, faithful man. Now he's an elderly man. But in verse 3, we read, now Daniel so distinguished himself. Now, does that surprise anybody? How did Daniel always so distinguish himself? How was he able to do that?
Dependent upon God.
Yeah, the Spirit was in him. I mean, he had the Spirit of God. This story is really similar to the story of Joseph in the Old Testament. You remember everywhere Joseph went, people could see that Spirit of God in him, and he rose up. He was able to, he got promotions. He ended up in leadership positions, not because he was hungry for power, like neither was Daniel. It's because people see something in them, and it's the Spirit of God, and they want to be around those faithful, honest people with integrity. And so that's what Daniel did. He demonstrates not only seniority but superiority over his peers, and he's promoted. So the plan the king has says Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps. So out of those 120 satraps, the 3 administrators, Daniel was the cream of the crop. Once again, he rises to the very top. And it says the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. So once again, in a new kingdom, Medo-Persian Empire, totally new empire, Daniel is going to find himself in a position of second in command. Now, how do you think all the others felt about that?
Oh, they probably hated it.
Jealous.
Jealousy. I mean, you remember what happened to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Another very well-known story back in Daniel chapter 3. When Daniel and then Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, when they were made wise men, and they were basically, Daniel was made the chief of the wise men. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego rose up to a high level. What did all the other wise men try to do to them at that point?
Scheme to get them killed.
Scheme to get them killed by having them thrown into that fiery furnace. And God protected them. The fourth man in the fire. We know that story. God protected them. And now the same thing is going to happen to Daniel. So in verse 4 we read, at this being Daniel's promotion to second in command, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs. Now, what's that mean?
They're trying to discredit him.
Yeah, how are they trying to do that? What do you think they did to try to find grounds to discredit Daniel and with respect to his governmental affairs?
Corruption.
Tried to find some corruption. Do we see that around in our society today? Everybody just gets along. Nobody looks.
very fun.
I mean, it's the same type of stuff that we see now all over social media. These guys were doing way back then, and it comes from for them it was jealousy. I mean, it came from a place of jealousy and envy, and they decide we're going to find some dirt on Daniel, and we are going to expose it. Is what they thought. And, it doesn't matter what you do. Any of us. It doesn't matter in your workplace. Kids in school, even in the church sometimes. If somebody is setting themselves apart, there's going to be somebody else that's going to have some feeling of resentment or jealousy. That's human nature. Sadly, it's prevalent, and but we see it, and there's always going to be somebody looking to knock people down that have sort of risen to the top. And that's what these men were doing. But were they successful in finding any corruption? No. Now that says a lot about Daniel, doesn't it? That you've got at least 120 these 120 satraps and probably the two other administrators. They probably had friends and family working with them, trying to find some dirt on Daniel. I mean, they were digging, and Daniel had been in the business for a long time, and they couldn't find a single thing.
They didn't have the internet.
They did not have the internet. No public record request back then. So, Daniel, maybe it was a little more difficult for them, but they couldn't find a thing. And it tells us why. It says, no, they could not find corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. In other words, he was a man of integrity. And, integrity is...
Few and far between.
Well, it is few and far between, but it's basically, ask yourself, not just your conduct, how you carry yourself, how you behave when you're out in front of people. Because it's easy, some people can't do it, but it's easier to behave or be on your best behavior when you're in front of a crowd. But when no one's watching, when you think no one's going to know, that's when true integrity, and I think we all, if we're being honest, would admit we've done things that probably we're not real proud of. Anybody?
Oh, yeah.
I know I have. And the thought sometimes crosses your mind, I hope nobody finds out about this. But for Daniel, I'm sure Daniel was not a perfect man. There's only been one perfect man walk this earth. Daniel wasn't perfect, but he was a man of integrity. And so they could find nothing in him. There's a verse here. Paul says in Philippians 2:14 and 15, do everything without complaining or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God, without fault in a crooked and depraved generation in which you shine like stars in the universe. And Daniel, he was shining like a star in the universe. Now, people don't always like that, but he was shining, and they could find nothing on him. And they acknowledged in verse 5, and this is funny. I mean, you have people hunting and hunting to find something to bring this man down, and they have to acknowledge in verse 5, it says, finally, these men said. What does the finally tell us?
If they found something.
Well, no, not that they found something, but finally.
They gave up.
They worked and worked and worked, and then finally realized we're not going to find anything. So they said, we will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God.
Now they're treading in dangerous waters when they're involving God.
Yeah, involving God, they are in dangerous waters. But could somebody say the same about you or me? Would you want them to say the same about you or me? If somebody's trying to bring you down, would you want someone to say, I can't really find anything on this person other than he Christian, he's always talking about Jesus. And that's what all they could say about Daniel. I mean, that was the only fault they could find. That's not a fault, but it's the only thing that they thought they could find. That tells us something about Daniel's faithfulness to God. It wasn't done in secret, right?
Right.
I mean, Daniel, his whole life has never been bashful. We go back all the way to the beginning of this book of Daniel, and time again, Daniel stood firm in his faith. And he didn't care what happened to him. He wasn't worried about the consequence. He was worried about serving God. His faithfulness the evidence of his faith was written all over his life. And I hope people say the same about us. And if they don't, it's not too late to change that. We can always make that change. So verse 6, they hatch a plan here because they know they're not going to be able to bring Daniel down with anything other than his faith in his God. So here's their plan. It says, so the administrators and the satraps went as a group to the king. So you got the 120, and then you got the 2 other administrators, and they all posse up, and they go to the king, and they say, oh, King Darius, live forever. Now, that's the customary greeting, but, kind of buttering him up a little bit. And it says the royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors. So it's even more than just the satraps and those administrators. They brought all these other government officials. So they got everybody that they possibly could. They go to the king and they say, we have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or man during the next 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be thrown into the lion's den. So, now I will say this, first of all. Archaeological digs in the area of the Persian Empire do reflect some evidence that there were actually dens of lions there, that this was a real thing. I wasn't there, so I never saw it, but I would imagine that'd be a pretty rough way to go. But there is some evidence that this was a reality in this culture. And first of all, they told a little lie there. Did anybody catch what the lie is? There's a little lie there that they tell in verse 7.
It says all.
Yeah, it says they've all agreed. They're leaving one out, aren't they? Daniel. They tell the king, we've all agreed. But Daniel wasn't there. And Daniel wasn't one of those that went before the king. Now, they put in his mind to issue this decree that basically says what? What's the decree say in layman's terms?
You can't worship God. Can't pray to God.
Don't worship anyone but the king.
Don't worship any god
Any God other
except
than
for the King Darius. Now, is King Darius a god? No. But is there a practice, or was there a practice of deifying the kings or leaders back in those days? Yes. When did that begin? Anybody know? I mean, clearly it was happening here. So the roots of that, the origins of that go back centuries earlier. But here in the Mesopotamian area is really where that began. That whole idea of deifying or worshiping as a god a human leader. And we see that type of stuff. I mean, they did it down with pharaohs. You remember that? Pharaohs? How about the Roman Empire? Caesar would be worshipped as a god. And so that continued. So that practice of deifying human rulers was in place clearly at this time, but it really originated right here in the Mesopotamian area. So they throw it out there to King Darius that, well, now why only 30 days? Why do you think they only did 30 days?
That's all they needed.
That's all they thought they needed. Why did they think that's all they needed?
Because he wasn't.
Daniel wouldn't go along with it.
They knew Daniel wouldn't go. How'd they know Daniel wasn't going to go along with it?
Prayed every day.
They knew his practice.
They knew his practices. Now, could you, if you or I were facing the lion's den, would it be easy enough to say, "Man, it's only 30 days"? I can pretend anything for 30 days to avoid becoming lion food. I mean, truly, and that's a temptation that we might consider. You know, same thing with back in chapter 3. You remember bowing, worshiping the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar put up.
It seems like a small thing, but it's not a small thing in the eyes of God to forget about him out of fear.
Right. It's not a small thing at all. And that's, you know, for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we said they could have bowed down and pretended like they're worshiping that golden image and really been praying to God, and no one would have been any the wiser. But God would have. And so it might seem like a small thing, but faith in the small things leads to faith in the big things. It starts with daily practices that become holy habits that then create character in us for God. And so Daniel, they knew, would never go along with this. So they knew it would only take 30 days to cause Daniel to run afoul of this decree. And King Darius, I don't believe, if we look at history and the way that he treated, already we can see the way he's treated Daniel. Don't believe he was a bad guy. But he gets duped here by these fellas. And he did have there was some vanity. They played on his vanity. How did they do that?
Left King forever.
Well, they do that, but then they tell him, we're going to praise no one but you, King, for 30 days. Was it really about Darius? Did they really have respect? No, it was utter disrespect is what this comes from, because they're playing him.
And they were trying to put him in a position to where he would be forced to act whether he wanted to or not.
Well, he had a choice. I do think he had a choice. He didn't have to issue the edict or the decree, but they put pressure on him publicly to do it and made it sound like this is a great thing for you, King. And so he went along with it. I don't think he really thought through the consequence, but he went along with it. So then in verse 8 they say, "Now, O king, issue the decree and put it in writing." Why did they want it to be put in writing? It's official, it's proof. It says in writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the laws of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. So that tells us something important about the Medo-Persian Empire. That once King Darius puts this into writing and issues this decree, even King Darius, who was the king, or Cyrus, whoever was the king at the time, could they go back and change it?
No.
They could not. That's something different about the Medo-Persian Empire that was different from Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was an absolute monarch, a despot. He could do whatever he wanted. But the Medo-Persian Empire, there are some changes. Remember, this is a different empire, a different kingdom, a different government. They had some similar practices, of course, but they had some differences too. And we read again down in, I think, verse 15. Yeah, it says, "These men later, they come back to the king, and they're going to remind him, 'Remember, O king, that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed.'" Now, we talked earlier about the book of Esther. You remember that? Esther takes place it's the Medo-Persian Empire. We said that's King Xerxes, who comes along here. He's several kings down from Cyrus, but King Xerxes is going to come into play. And in Esther chapter 1, verse 19, it mentions this. The people are pleading with the king that in 119, this was when King Xerxes' wife Vashti was disobedient to him. Do you remember, what would she not do? He was trying to get her to come in before him, and she wouldn't even come. Now, a lot of us men know what it's like to have your wife not listen to you. But we can't issue a decree or an edict to force her to, we can't do that. So, but the people came to King Xerxes in Esther 1:19, and they said, therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Would any man like an edict that says something like that? I don't think so. Better not raise your hand. But it references right there the rule of law. Once a decree is in place, it cannot be repealed. Again in Esther, in chapter 8, verse 8, it says, now write another decree in the king's name on behalf of the Jews, as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked. So that just helps give you a little context to what was going on. Because the book of Esther comes, 20, 30 years after the beginning of the empire here. But that shows you this practice or principle of law that the Medo-Persians had, that once this thing was in place, it couldn't be repealed. So these satraps and administrators, they know that all they have to do is get the king to issue this decree, sign it, and that's it. So they're really trying to dupe him into doing this and make it sound like it's only 30 days, but we want this to be remembered as, King Darius month, and we're going to just worship no one but you for 30 days. And it was all a lie. It was all a lie. And they really did play on his vanity, but he falls for it. In verse 9 says, so King Darius put the decree in writing. And there's no turning back. There's no turning back from that at this point. Verse 10. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, what did he do?
He went home.
He didn't really hesitate, did he? He didn't go make a picket sign and form a protest outside the palace. He didn't throw a fit and whine, and he went home to pray. He didn't care. Now, are we taught? Is there scriptural authority for submitting to our rulers? Even when we don't like them.
Yeah.
But is there a line to that? What's the line? It doesn't trump God. No human being trumps God. So where the law puts you in a position to run afoul of God's law prevails. And Daniel knew this, so he seems rather unfazed by the whole thing, really. When Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. So it didn't change a thing about his practice.
Made him stronger.
Well, maybe. It's at least as what he has done previously, he continues to do. And the people knew it. Now it says he went home to his. It's not that he's trying to do these things in private. We know that Daniel publicly displayed his faith as well. This was just his practice to go home, and his whatever home he's got here in Babylon, and his window faces west towards Jerusalem, and he faces Jerusalem. You can picture Daniel sitting in a little cottage right here in Babylon, window open, praying right here towards Jerusalem. And that's what he did, faithfully, 3 times a day. And we know this wasn't just a private thing, because people found out about it. So he went home 3 times a day, got down on his knees, prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. And then in verse 11, then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So this was all part of their setup. They knew what he would do. They knew that he would go pray just as he always did. They convinced the king to issue this decree. As soon as it's in place, they go and they got their video cameras trying to catch him praying. And he wasn't too worried about being caught. Like I said, he wasn't trying to be secretive about it. They caught him praying, and then what'd they do? Tattletales. Yeah, they went right to the king. Verse 12, their plan, they think their plan is just falling right into place. So in verse 12, then they immediately run back to the king and spoke to him about this royal decree. Now, do you think he forgot the decree that he'd issued, ordering worship to him for 30 days? He didn't forget it, but they run right back and they're like, hey, king, remember that decree? You made it Darius month? Well, they ask him, did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or man except to you, O king, would be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the laws of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. So there's that. They can't do anything about it now. Then they said to the king, so they're going to rat Daniel out. Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah. Now, can Daniel ever outlive that title of being one of the exiles from Judah? And that's not they don't say that in a favorable, good way. That's sort of a derogatory. They're reminding him, one of those slaves you brought that came from Judah 60, 70 years ago, one of those slave men, they didn't refer to him as the chief administrator. They say one of those exiles. But Daniel, one of those exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. Why was King Darius, and this tells us a little bit about his character, I think, why is he distressed?
He liked Daniel.
He likes Daniel.
And he knows what happens with his decree in regards to Daniel.
He knows what the decree says, what he has to do. He cannot do anything about it now. And he knows what has to happen, but he likes Daniel. Now he tries, he does what he can, because it says not only that he was greatly distressed, it says he was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. What do you think he did to try to save Daniel?
Stall.
Yeah, I was going to say, call the legal team. I need a loophole. I need a loophole here. So I think he called in his legal counsel and said, is there any way around this? And unfortunately, he learned there was no way around. Because as the law of the Medes and the Persians said, once that decree goes into effect, it cannot be repealed. Even future kings couldn't go back and change a decree or a law that had been put in place. It was too late. So he's making every effort to save him. But then these rascally men, they come and as a group, they come back to the king and they say, remember, O king, that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. I mean, is this not some of the most obvious? This is the most obvious attempt to set somebody up that I think you could possibly see. Yeah. And, as a kid reading Daniel's stories, I didn't fully grasp all that. I mean, I knew the gist of it. We learned, but the efforts that these men went to try to kill him are incredible. And we're about out of time. But what we'll get to next week is where the king had no other choice. And in verse 16, the king gave the order. They brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. And what did the king say to him? May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. So again, just like Nebuchadnezzar way back in the day, did Nebuchadnezzar know that Daniel served the one true God? Yes. Daniel's witness in Nebuchadnezzar's life is you can't say enough about his witness, the power of his witness.
His faithfulness to God is
His-
what kept the lions from attacking.
His faithfulness to God kept him alive. And we'll read about that next week. But the king, I believe, the king prayed that Daniel would be saved by his God. Now, whether King Darius ever comes to a faith in God or not, well, I don't know. Dorothy.
My Bible doesn't say may, it says thy God will.
Well, there you go. So that's faith, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's Darius showing some faith.
Yeah.
So, all right, that's the beginning of the story. We'll try to wrap it up next week. But if you bow your heads, I'll pray us out. Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this time together as always. Just love this class, and I love this group that you brought together. And we always are excited when we have new visitors. And I thank you for Earl today and Earl's decision. I just pray your continued blessing upon his life, and so thankful for him and the decisions that he's made, and the friends and the support that he has around him. So many people love him, Father, and we thank you for that. I just pray you'll continue to watch over us as a class and as a church family. Those that aren't here today, those that are facing illness and surgery and sickness, and just pray your comforting and healing hand will be upon all, Father. I pray you'll watch over and protect us, keep us safe as we go from here today until we gather again. Just watch over and protect all. We pray these things in the precious name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
All right, God bless you all.